While other children spent evenings curled up with storybooks, Caleb and Carter Mercer were knee-deep in mud, crawling under ropes and scaling makeshift walls in the backyard. But it wasn't chaos this time. It was training. At the center stood Maggie Rowe, a woman with a soldier's past and a heart still carrying battles of her own. From the terrace, billionaire Jonathan Mercer froze, his keys slipping in his hand. His voice cracked in disbelief. "Jonathan, what on earth have you done to my lawn?" Maggie didn't flinch, her tone calm and commanding. "Maggie, not a lawn, sir. A base. And your boys, they're not wild, they're cadets." The twins, laughing, clasped muddy hands and raised a crooked clay medal toward their stunned father. Carter. "Look, Dad, we made this for you." Caleb. "Team Mercer." "We're together now." Jonathan's chest tightened as their salute cut through months of silence. For the first time since his wife's death, the mansion wasn't echoing with grief, but with discipline, laughter, and something dangerously close to hope. What Maggie had built here wasn't just order, it was the beginning of a revolution inside his broken home. Stay with us to witness how one fearless woman and two unruly boys turned mourning into mission, and how a billionaire father finally learned what it means to belong. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? The late autumn wind blew through Austin, Texas, carrying the scent of cedar and wet earth, sweeping over a city that glowed with glass towers and restless traffic. But at the edge of town stood a mansion that felt more like a fortress than a home. The Mercer estate rose behind black iron gates, its white stone walls polished by wealth but weathered by grief. Above the rooftops, the sky stretched pale gray, restless with a storm that never quite arrived, like a sigh caught in the chest. Inside lived a man who carried storms of his own, Jonathan Mercer, a billionaire whose empire of software and data security stretched across the globe, yet who could not control the chaos that waited in his own backyard. Jonathan was 42, tall with a rugged frame that once belonged to an athlete before boardrooms carved lines of fatigue into his face. His dark hair, now flecked with gray at the temples, was combed back in the morning but always disheveled by evening, as though even grooming surrendered to exhaustion. His hazel eyes, sharp in public, dulled in private, carried shadows of sleepless nights. Jonathan wore wealth like armor-tailored navy suits, stainless watches, the smell of leather and cologne. But when he stripped them off at night, there was only a man hollowed out by loss. A year ago, his wife, Rebecca, had died suddenly in a car accident, and the mansion had grown unbearably silent ever since. Silence was not peace. Silence was absence, and Jonathan filled it with work. He built more companies, signed more contracts, doubled his fortune, all while his home unraveled behind him. At the heart of that unraveling were his 6-year-old twins, Caleb and Carter Mercer. Both boys were small hurricanes wrapped in blue jackets, each one stitched with their late mother's initials, gifts she had given before she passed. They wore them every day like banners of defiance. Caleb, the older twin by 7 minutes, had sharp features and restless gray eyes that gleamed with mischief. He ran headlong into everything, crashing through rules as if testing the strength of every wall. Carter was rounder in the face, with soft brown eyes that looked innocent until they narrowed into conspiracies with his brother. If Caleb was the fire starter, Carter was the accomplice, ready to amplify chaos with giggles that echoed like taunts. Together they were a force of destruction. Overturned vases, graffiti on marble walls, paint splattered across glass windows. 9 nannies had tried. 9 nannies had failed. The first left after being locked in a closet with a bucket of frogs. The second quit when her car was filled with mud. By the 5th, Jonathan stopped asking their names. Each came with polished resumes and warm smiles, and each fled within weeks. The Mercer twins, ungoverned by grief and emboldened by neglect, made their home a battlefield. Jonathan, too consumed by deals and stock prices, convinced himself it was temporary. But one morning when Carter threw a chair through the glass door of the dining room, Jonathan caught his reflection in the shards an empire builder undone by two children barely tall enough to reach the countertop. Still, work gave him excuses. He told himself he didn't have time for bedtime stories or discipline charts. He told himself the boys were simply wild, that it wasn't his fault. But guilt trailed him like a shadow. He had been present when investors demanded his signature, absent when his sons cried for attention. He buried himself deeper into screens and silence, hoping money could solve what love no longer touched. Then came Maggie Rowe. She arrived on a gray Monday morning, standing at the gate with one suitcase and no smile. Maggie was 34, with a tall, lean frame that carried the echoes of long marches and sleepless nights. Her skin was sun-warmed but pale around the eyes from fatigue. Black hair, threaded with a few premature streaks of silver, was tied back in a tight bun that betrayed military habit. She wore no makeup, only a plain green jacket over a navy shirt, jeans, and scuffed boots that told more stories than her words. There was a scar just below her jawline, faint but deliberate, as if reminding her of places she never spoke about. Her posture was straight without stiffness. She didn't fidget or force pleasantries. She waited. Maggie had been an army nurse for nearly a decade, serving in dusty bases overseas, patching wounds under the roar of helicopters. There she had learned calm in the face of screaming chaos, composure when lives slipped between her fingers. But the war had taken more than it gave. Her younger brother, Elliot Rowe, a former Marine, had returned broken from the front, his leg shattered, his spirit heavier than the shrapnel that had nearly killed him. Elliot, once fearless, now lived in a rehabilitation center, bitter and silent. Maggie carried him like a hidden wound. Her purpose was simple: find work that paid enough to cover his treatments and remind him that the world still had meaning. Jonathan met her at the door, skepticism drawn across his face. He had grown accustomed to polished agency professionals, women with degrees in childcare and smiles rehearsed for interviews. Maggie was different. She didn't present glowing recommendations. She presented a single page of experience: Army nurse, home aide, caretaker. Her handshake was firm, her gaze steady. "You know what you're walking into?" Jonathan asked, voice low, testing. "I've faced worse," Maggie replied evenly. He studied her, waiting for arrogance, but none came. Only conviction. Against his better judgment, he led her through. The first meeting between Maggie and the twins unfolded like a clash of worlds. Caleb and Carter, armed with toy swords, blocked the hallway with dramatic shouts. "No one passes without tribute," Caleb declared, eyes glinting with rebellion. Carter giggled, echoing, "Pay the toll." Normally, new nannies flinched, tried to appease them with candy or threats. Maggie did neither. She crouched down to their level, her expression unshaken, and said, "I don't pay tolls. I negotiate missions." The twins blinked. Confusion, brief but telling, washed across their faces. "What's a mission?" Carter asked, lowering his plastic blade. "It's when chaos has rules," she answered. They looked at each other, uncertain whether to laugh or attack. Jonathan watched from behind, arms crossed, ready to witness failure. But instead of shouting, Maggie pulled from her pocket a small notebook, worn at the edges, filled with scribbles. She flipped to a blank page, wrote Mission 1 in block letters, and tore it out. "Your mission," she said, handing it to Caleb, "is to show me your battlefield." The boys exchanged wary glances, then bolted down the hall, screaming with glee, dragging Maggie into their mess. They showed her the paint-streaked walls, the broken toys, the backyard littered with overturned chairs and half-dug holes. She didn't scold, she didn't praise. She observed like a soldier surveying terrain. And when they finally collapsed in grass, breathless, Maggie simply nodded. "Good battlefield," she said. "Now let's make it a base." That night, Jonathan found himself pacing the living room, unable to concentrate on his laptop. He could hear faint echoes from upstairs, no screaming, no breaking glass, only murmurs of Maggie's steady voice. When he finally peeked, he froze at the sight. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor between Caleb and Carter's beds, reading aloud from a battered paperback copy of Treasure Island. The twins, notorious insomniacs who once hurled pillows at Nannies, were listening. Their blue jackets lay crumpled beside them, forgotten for once. Jonathan felt something stir, a mixture of awe and resentment. Who was this woman who calmed storms in a day? Why had 9 others failed where she succeeded? He wanted to believe it was temporary, that soon she'd meet her breaking point. Yet a part of him, quiet, unwilling, hoped she wouldn't. Maggie, unaware of his presence, closed the book gently and tucked the boys in with practiced care. For a moment, Jonathan saw not just discipline, but tenderness, and he realized with a weight that tightened his chest that he had been absent from this very moment for too long. The next morning in Austin dawned unusually bright, the kind of winter sun that sharpened edges and pulled every color into sharper relief, so that the Mercer estate gleamed white against the pale sky, while the manicured grass spread like a carpet too perfect to belong to real life. From a distance, the property looked untouchable, a fortress of wealth and order. Up close, chaos lurked behind every polished surface, and Jonathan Mercer knew it. He stood at the broad kitchen window in a black sweater and slacks, nursing his coffee with the weary dignity of a man who hadn't slept properly in months. His hazel eyes had lost their boardroom fire. Instead, they were fixed on the backyard where Maggie Rowe was moving with quiet determination, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder, a bundle of cones under her arm, and the kind of calm authority that unsettled Jonathan more than any tantrum ever had. Maggie had risen before the boys, before Rosa the housekeeper, before Jonathan himself. She had spent the early hour transforming the pristine lawn into something unrecognizable, a training ground. She looped the rope between the sturdy posts of 2 oaks, creating a crawl space barely high enough for a child's elbows to clear. She rolled 3 dusty tires from the gardener's shed into a jagged line. She leaned a weathered plywood board against the fence, securing it with cinder blocks into a makeshift climbing wall. And on the patio stone she chalked 3 words in large, decisive strokes: ritual, purpose, belonging. The letters were uneven, smudged by her boots, but they stood out like a banner. When Jonathan slid the glass door open and stepped outside, the air smelled of dew and cedar. His first instinct was sarcasm. "That lawn costs more to maintain than some small countries," he muttered, gesturing to the makeshift obstacle course. Maggie didn't look at him. Her hair was pulled tight in that no-nonsense bun, her jacket still the same green, her jeans faded but tough. She knelt to check the rope tension, tested it with a tug, and only then said, "Perfection is useless if no one can touch it. Kids don't need a museum, they need a base." Her tone made him bristle. He was used to employees who deferred, who flattered. Maggie had no such instinct. But before he could retort, the sound of thunder from upstairs announced the arrival of the storm. Caleb and Carter, clad as always in their battered blue jackets, burst through the sliding door like 2 cannonballs of energy. Their hair stuck up at angles, their eyes glittered with mischief, and for once they stopped dead in awe. "What's this?" Caleb demanded, his voice already commanding though his legs were barely long enough to straddle the threshold. "A mission," Maggie said evenly, her hands behind her back like a drill sergeant who had all day. "Welcome to the Blue Campaign." Carter, always the more excitable, bounced on his toes. "Do we get blasters? Or lasers? Or better," she interrupted, crouching so her gaze was level with theirs, "you get rules. 5 of them. Rule 1. We start together, we finish together. Rule 2, we take turns. Rule 3, shouting is only for victory or emergencies. Rule 4, if you fall, you try again. Rule 5, after every mission, you name what you did well before you say what to fix." The boys glanced at each other, skepticism and curiosity flickering across their faces. Jonathan, leaning against the doorframe, half expected the usual rebellion. A thrown shoe, a mocking laugh. But something in Maggie's cadence, a rhythm built from years of counting heartbeats in war zones, stilled them. She slipped 2 braided cords from her pocket, dark blue paracord bands, and fastened them around the boys' wrists. Cadet bands, she explained. Not ranks. Promises. Caleb lifted his wrist like a soldier might check his stripes. What's the first mission? Show me you can start without arguing about who goes first, Maggie replied. The trap was clever. Normally the spark of rivalry would ignite in an instant, Caleb demanding leadership, Carter whining for fairness. But Maggie didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch. The twins shifted under its weight. Finally, Caleb rolled his eyes with exaggerated drama and announced, "Fine, Carter first." Jonathan nearly dropped his coffee. The crawl came first. Carter slid under the rope, squealing at the icy grass, but instead of throwing a tantrum, he laughed at himself, his small body wriggling like a snake. Caleb, stationed as spotter, clasped his hands behind his back, Maggie's instructions clear, and shouted encouragement. "Left elbow? Keep going, snake boy." When Carter emerged, mud streaking his jacket, his grin was wider than the mess. The tire hops followed. Caleb insisted on trying single-foot jumps. He wobbled, nearly toppled, but Maggie's feedback was precise. Good choice testing balance. Caleb straightened instantly, as if her words had grafted stability into his bones. Carter, imitating his brother, hopped clumsily but beamed when he landed the last tire. Then came the wall. Caleb charged and stalled halfway, fingers slipping. Jonathan braced for the explosion, anger, tears, the familiar cycle. But Maggie simply placed her palm against the plywood. "There are holds you can't see until you feel them," she said. Her voice was low, deliberate. Caleb tested again, found a nailhead ridge, and pushed up. The triumph on his face was fierce. Carter hesitated at the base, fear pulling at his small features. "I'll spot you," Caleb offered. When Carter slipped halfway, he whispered, "Reset," and together they climbed. At the cones, Maggie introduced hand signals, 2 fingers forward for go, palm down for lower volume, a tap to the chest for her turn. The boys quickly turned silence into a competition. If they finished with fewer than 3 signals, they earned a flourish. Carter invented a ridiculous seal-like roll. Caleb executed an exaggerated bow that ended in laughter. From the patio steps, Jonathan's skepticism began to crumble. He had spent months convinced his sons were uncontrollable, convinced their chaos was inevitable. Yet here they were, following signals, laughing without cruelty, helping each other. He found himself stepping closer without realizing, his coffee forgotten. Lunch arrived with the voice of Rosa Delgado, the housekeeper. Rosa was in her early 50s, short and wiry, her coppery hair braided tight, her brown eyes quick but kind. She had been with the Mercers for years, long enough to remember Rebecca's laughter echoing through these same halls. She carried herself like a woman who respected order but understood mischief. Her own boys had once been terrors too. "Lunch in 1 hour," she called. 1 hour. Peanut butter, apples, milk. Carter, surprising even himself, nodded politely. "Gracias, Rosa." Rosa's eyebrows shot up. She shot Maggie a look of quiet approval before disappearing inside. After one more round of the course, Maggie gathered the boys around a sheet of butcher paper. She drew the layout with a blue marker, labeling each station. In the corner, she drew a small square. "Headquarters," she explained. "HQ. No matter what happens, you return here. Together, like respawn," Carter said, thinking of his video games. "Exactly," Maggie nodded. Jonathan hovered, unable to resist. "Where do I go?" he asked, half a joke, half a plea. She drew a triangle outside the square, labeled it Witness. "Every mission needs one." He laughed, a real laugh that startled him, and for a moment he felt lighter. The afternoon continued with variations. Maggie introduced a ritual for failure. When one boy stumbled, the other knelt beside him and counted to 3, and together they stood. Simple, effective. By the 3rd run, Carter slipped at the wall again, but instead of collapsing into tears, he steadied when Caleb whispered, 3. They climbed together, the grin they shared brighter than the sun. By dusk, chalk dust smudged the patio, but the words remained visible. Ritual, purpose, belonging. Maggie unclipped the paracord bands, coiling them carefully. "Tomorrow," she said, "we add a captain." The twins begged to know what that meant, but she only smiled. The captain goes first at waiting. Jonathan caught the paradox and tucked it away. As the boys tumbled inside, Rosa ushering them toward hand-washing, Jonathan found himself standing beside Maggie at the chalk words. The air was cooling, his breath fogging faintly. "I didn't think I'd ever see them take turns," he admitted, voice raw. Maggie didn't gloat. She touched the word belonging with her fingertip, leaving a chalk smear. Turns aren't about order. They're about trust. He looked at her for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you." Far across town, in a rehabilitation center tucked under sprawling live oaks, Maggie's younger brother Elliot Rowe sat in a wheelchair by a window. He was 32, his once broad frame diminished but not erased, his hair close cut, his jaw shadowed with neglect. His right leg, hidden beneath a hospital blanket, bore the scars of shrapnel and surgery. His dark eyes, once quick with humor, now stared through glass at a sky too big to enter. In his lap rested an envelope addressed in his sister's blocky handwriting. He had ignored it for days. He told himself he didn't need reminders of what he'd lost. But tonight, as the nurse passed humming, he slid a finger under the flap. The sound of paper tearing was too loud. He froze, then shoved the envelope into the trash. The corner he'd ripped remained in his hand, showing one word scrawled in blue marker: home. Elliot crushed it in his fist, then let it fall, his jaw hard. He told himself hope was for fools. The third morning in the Mercer household carried with it a different tone, almost imperceptible at first, but real enough that Rosa Delgado, who had cleaned and cooked in this house for more than a decade, paused mid-step in the kitchen to listen. The usual clang of toy swords on banisters was missing. Instead, muffled voices drifted down, punctuated not by shrieks, but by laughter, rough-edged, unpracticed laughter that sounded as if it had been locked away and was finally rattling free. Outside, the weather had shifted too. The sharp Texas sun had softened under a curtain of light clouds, laying a cool calm over the estate, as if nature itself recognized the need for a reprieve from chaos. Jonathan Mercer sat at the long oak dining table, laptop open but forgotten, the cursor blinking on a page of numbers he could not bring himself to absorb. His hazel eyes kept flicking toward the doorway as though expecting the eruption of trouble that always came before breakfast. When Maggie Rowe appeared, she was carrying not a tray or rope or cones, but a small chalkboard under one arm, the kind teachers used before classrooms became digital. Her plain green jacket was replaced today by a simple gray sweater, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair pulled back as ever, though a strand had escaped and softened the line of her face. Her expression carried the same steady resolve, but there was also something new, quiet satisfaction, like a soldier who has tested a map and found it sound. Without asking permission, she set the board on the counter near the refrigerator. With slow, deliberate strokes of white chalk, she wrote 3 words across its black surface: ritual, purpose, belonging. She underlined each, the dust gathering on her fingertips like pale scars. Caleb and Carter barreled into the kitchen in their blue jackets, sneakers squeaking on tile, but stopped short when they saw the board. Carter tilted his head, squinting. "What's that?" Maggie crouched, so she was eye level with them. "These are the rules that matter more than all others. Ritual means the things we do every day, no matter what. Purpose means knowing why we're doing them. Belonging means we do it as a team, not alone." She tapped each word as she spoke. "We're going to make them part of your day." Caleb snorted, already bracing for lecture. "Like chores?" "No," Maggie said, her voice calm. "Like missions. But these missions don't end. They repeat, and every time you repeat them, you get stronger." Rosa leaned against the counter, arms folded, skeptical but curious. Jonathan, pretending to scroll his emails, found himself holding his breath. The first ritual was deceptively simple: shoes. Every day the twins scattered their sneakers across the house, a trail of mud and chaos that made Rosa mutter under her breath. Maggie lined up 2 spots by the door, drew chalk outlines on the floor tiles, and handed each boy his shoes. Ritual. Shoes here, always. Purpose. So we don't waste time searching. Belonging. We do it together. Caleb rolled his eyes but slid his sneakers into place. Carter followed, lining his up awkwardly but trying. Maggie had them step back and look. Now high-five each other, mission complete. Their palms slapped, hesitant but real. Something in Jonathan's chest tightened. The second ritual came after breakfast. Maggie poured juice and set down their plates, then waited. The boys began shoving at each other for the first glass, as usual, but she raised a hand. Belonging first. She clasped her own hands together and waited until they did the same. Now, who wants to go first at waiting? The paradox stunned them into silence. Caleb blinked, then laughed at the absurdity. I'll wait, he said slowly. Carter's grin widened, triumphant, but instead of gloating, he poured juice and passed the glass carefully. Maggie clapped once, softly. Mission, trust disguised as turns, complete. Jonathan set down his mug, staring. This was no bribery, no punishment, no charts with gold stars, no threats of lost screen time. It was rhythm, steady and patient, built from the inside out. Ritual seeped into the day in other ways. Maggie guided them to brush teeth side by side, not racing, not shrieking, but humming the same tune together. She called it synchronized mission prep. She showed them how to fold jackets over the backs of chairs when they sat, how to clap hands before starting any new task, how to shake hands when finishing. Each gesture was small, laughable on its own, but together it created a current. By noon, Jonathan realized his home sounded different. Not silent, not destructive, but alive. Midway through the morning, Duchess the house cat padded into the kitchen. She was 6 years old, sleek with cream and gray fur, a creature who lived by her own rules. She leapt onto the counter, tail flicking. Carter reached out, expecting rejection. This time, Duchess did not move away. She sniffed his fingers, allowed the briefest stroke of fur, then hopped down to sit beside the chalkboard as though claiming it for herself. She belongs too, Maggie said simply, and Carter's eyes lit up. Later that day, Maggie introduced a new activity in the living room. She spread butcher paper across the coffee table, uncapped blue markers, and instructed the twins to draw. Anything? Caleb asked. Anything that makes you feel strong, she replied. The boys huddled together, tongues sticking out in concentration, and soon the page was flooded with messy shapes, ropes, cones, a crooked wall, a lopsided house with a flag. At the bottom, Carter scrawled words in blocky, uneven letters. Uncle Elliot is our hero. The ink bled in heavy blue, blotting the page. Maggie's throat tightened. She had not told them to write about Elliot. They had pieced together fragments from her stories, from overheard phone calls. She folded the paper carefully, sliding it into an envelope. Across town, in the rehabilitation center, Elliot Rowe sat by the window again, his wheelchair angled toward a slice of oak trees swaying in the afternoon breeze. His jaw was dark with stubble, his leg aching from the metal that bound it. The nurse, Tanya McKee, passed in the hall, humming an old country tune. She was in her 40s, with kind brown eyes and bracelets her niece had made, and she often checked on Elliot even when he pretended not to notice. She paused by his chair, offering a soft smile. Mail today, she said, laying an envelope on his lap. Then she moved on. Elliot stared at the handwriting. His sister's blocky script. His fingers twitched, torn between anger and longing. He opened it with a sigh, expecting words of duty. Instead, the drawing slid out, unfurling like a secret. He stared at the crooked shapes, the blue splatters, and the uneven letters. Uncle Elliot is our hero, his breath caught. His breath. His hand trembled. For the first time in months, his eyes blurred with tears. He pressed the paper to his chest, lips quivering, a soldier undone not by war, but by love, in childish scrawl. Back at the mansion, Maggie was in the kitchen when Jonathan entered, tie loosened, expression cautious. "What did they draw?" he asked, sensing her mood. She lifted the empty envelope. "A reminder," she said softly, "that they already know how to belong. They just needed someone to show them the shape of it." Jonathan studied her, then the chalkboard, then the faint chalk dust on her sweater. For a brief, unguarded moment, gratitude filled his tired face. That night, as the twins brushed teeth in rhythm, as their jackets lay folded neatly by the chairs, Jonathan lingered outside their door. He heard Maggie's voice, steady and warm, guiding them through a new ritual. "What did you do well today?" Caleb answered first. "I remembered to breathe when I climbed." Carter followed. "I was brave before I knew I was." Maggie's response was simple. "Mission complete." Jonathan turned away, a strange smile on his lips. For the first time since Rebecca's death, the house did not feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a place being rebuilt, brick by brick, laughter by belonging. The sky over Austin thickened with bruised clouds by late afternoon, the kind that gathered without hurry but carried menace in their folds. The city below hummed with its usual pulse of traffic, lights flickering on in office towers as though preparing against what was coming. At the edge of town, the Mercer estate stood like a ship anchored in the storm's path. Wind rattled the iron gates, sent dry leaves scraping along the stone driveway, and pressed against windows already lined with rain's first impatient taps. Jonathan Mercer sensed the shift long before the lights failed. He stood in his home office, a cavernous room paneled with oak, the walls lined with leather-bound books he rarely touched. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled, hair mussed from running his fingers through it in frustration over numbers that would not add up. The storm was a distraction, yes, but more than that, it carried memory. Rebecca had loved storms. She claimed thunder reminded her of childhood nights spent counting seconds between lightning and sound. The thought of her in weather like this made Jonathan's throat tighten. He sipped his drink but tasted nothing. Downstairs, Maggie Rowe was already preparing. She had seen storms of another kind, sandstorms that turned the horizon to nothing, mortar blasts that killed electricity in seconds, and the silent panic of wounded soldiers when darkness fell too fast. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, pulling a box of candles from Rose's pantry, gathering flashlights from drawers where batteries had long since corroded. Her gray sweater sleeves were pushed high, her hair escaping its bun in loose strands, but her stride was precise. Rosa Delgado hovered in the kitchen, nervously wiping her hands on her apron. Rosa was sturdy and brisk, her copper braids swinging as she worked, but storms made her uneasy. She had grown up in San Antonio where floods swallowed streets in hours, and ever since then, heavy rain rattled her more than she liked to admit. She muttered prayers under her breath in Spanish, half for herself and half for the boys. Duchess, the aloof seal point cat, crouched on the counter, tail twitching in agitation, eyes wide at the scent of static in the air. The twins, Caleb and Carter, were delighted. To them, the flickering lights and gusts outside were an invitation to chaos. In their blue jackets, they charged through hallways like storm fronts of their own, wielding flashlights as sabers, their voices bouncing off marble and glass. "Attack!" Caleb shouted. "Defend the fortress!" Carter squealed in agreement. Then, without warning, the house plunged into silence. Power died with a soft click that seemed louder than thunder. The hum of the refrigerator, the steady throb of air conditioning, the glow of recessed lights, all gone. Darkness swallowed the wide rooms. For Jonathan, walking down from his office, it was an old nightmare. He had seen nights like this since Rebecca's death, when silence and shadows made him feel like the house itself was grieving. His jaw tightened, and his first thought was dread. The boys would spin into frenzy, smashing, screaming, undoing the fragile order Maggie had built. And indeed, the twins screamed, but with laughter. Flashlight beams darted wildly, catching Rose's startled face, Maggie's calm one, and Jonathan's tense silhouette. They were shrieking not from fear, but from joy at being unleashed. Jonathan braced himself for the crash of glass, the topple of lamps. But Maggie clapped her hands once, sharp. Her voice cut through the dark like a line of light. "Cadets!" she barked, her military tone more evident now than ever. "New mission. Operation Light Up." The boys froze, their laughter hiccuping. Carter turned his beam toward her face, and she squinted but didn't flinch. "What's that?" he asked. "Your mission," she said, kneeling so her face glowed ghost-like in the candle she had just lit, "is to chase the dark away. We need teams, we need strategy, and we need a commander." The twins gasped, eyes darting to Jonathan. Maggie didn't look at him, but her words landed squarely. "Commander Mercer will lead the operation." Jonathan blinked. "What?" Carter bounced. "Dad's the commander?" Caleb saluted dramatically, nearly poking his eye with the flashlight. "Commander Dad!" Jonathan stood stiff, caught between protest and confusion. He had spent months hiding behind work, watching Maggie shoulder battles he hadn't dared to fight. Now the title sat heavy on his shoulders. Maggie's eyes met his in the glow, steady, insistent. "Commander," she said quietly but firmly. The twins cheered. Jonathan exhaled and stepped forward. "All right," he said slowly. "Operation Light Up." The words felt strange but not unwelcome. Maggie handed out candles like medals, Rosa holding the matches with trembling hands. Each boy carried a flashlight and a candle stub. Maggie gave Jonathan the largest lantern she had found, its handle warm from years of storage. "Commander's light," she said. The mission began. Maggie split the house into sectors. The dining room became Alpha Zone, the living room Bravo, the kitchen Charlie. Each boy was assigned to clear a zone by setting one candle in a safe spot, then reporting back. Rosa, despite her nerves, played along, guarding the kitchen like a sentry. Duchess stalked through corridors, occasionally startling the boys when her eyes caught the beam. Jonathan followed them, lantern high, his voice louder than he expected. "Bravo Zone clear!" he called, half laughing at himself. Caleb mimicked him. "Alpha Zone clear!" Carter added, "Charlie Zone super clear!" Their giggles ricocheted through the halls. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against glass, thunder rolling like drums. Inside, flickering lights multiplied, shadows danced on high ceilings, and laughter stitched itself into the fabric of the house. Jonathan found himself smiling, really smiling, as Carter tugged his sleeve. "Commander, we need you to light the big hall." The boy's face was alive with expectation, trust glimmering in his eyes. Jonathan crouched, lit a candle, and together they set it in the center of the hall table. For a heartbeat, Jonathan felt Rebecca beside him, the way she used to laugh in storms, how she would have loved this moment. His throat burned, but the sound that came out was laughter, raw and sudden, bursting louder than thunder. The twins froze, startled. Then they laughed too, throwing themselves against him, their small arms muddy and warm. "Commander Dad!" they chanted. Maggie watched from the kitchen doorway, her candle steady, her face softened by shadows. Rosa, whispering another prayer, smiled quietly to herself. Duchess flicked her tail and curled on the windowsill, content at last. The storm would pass by morning. Power would return, screens would glow, routines would resume. But tonight, in the dark, something shifted. Jonathan was no longer just a witness to Maggie's campaign. He had stepped into the mission, into the mud and laughter of his children's lives. And for the first time in over a year, the house did not mourn. It lived. The storm had passed, leaving the Texas morning air washed clean and crisp, but peace rarely lasted long in the Mercer household. Within days of Operation Light Up, the twins returned to school, their blue jackets zipped up like armor. At first, things seemed different. They carried themselves with a strange new discipline Maggie had cultivated, humming little mission songs under their breath, reminding each other to reset when shoelaces tangled or pencils rolled away. Jonathan had dared to hope. But on Thursday afternoon, the call came. Jonathan sat in his glass-walled office downtown. The skyline of Austin stretched beyond him. His suit was dark, his tie flawless, his hair smoothed back to its old, polished form. yet his phone pressed to his ear made his posture sag. The voice on the other end belonged to Principal Helen Whitmore, a woman in her late 50s with a thin frame and sharp features softened only by reading glasses perched low on her nose. Helen had been in education for over 30 years, her patience worn but not gone. She had seen too many families outsource love to money and too many children paying the price. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice calm but edged with weariness, "Caleb was in a fight today." Another student shoved him. He shoved back harder. Punches were thrown. Nothing broken, but the message is spreading fast. The Mercer twins are being branded again, uncontrollable, dangerous. Jonathan's jaw clenched. His mind flashed back to headlines, to whispers in boardrooms. He thanked her curtly, ended the call, and sat in silence staring at his own reflection in the black screen of his computer. His empire depended on reputation, investors, clients, partners. And now, the old rumors about his children's chaos had life again. Back at the mansion, Maggie met him at the door. She had already heard news traveled fast when parents texted and gossiped in the pickup line. She stood steady, gray sweater rolled at the sleeves, hair frizzed from the humid day, her eyes unwavering. Jonathan stormed in, voice low but dangerous. "It's happening again. You said you had them under control. They're not soldiers, Jonathan. They're 6-year-old boys learning how to belong." "Investors don't care about belonging," he snapped. "They care about headlines. And today's headline is that my son bloodied another boy's nose." Rosa, carrying a basket of folded laundry, froze in the hall at his tone. The twins peeked from behind the banister upstairs, their faces pale. Maggie refused to raise her voice. "Then we show them structure instead of punishment. Caleb fought because he doesn't yet know what to do with his strength. We'll give him a mission captaincy." Jonathan frowned. "What?" "In the Army," Maggie explained, her voice controlled. "A captain isn't just the one who commands. He's the one who carries responsibility for others. We rotate the role. Today, Caleb leads by helping. Tomorrow, Carter. They'll bring that to class. A mission they understand." Jonathan laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "That won't fix investors. I can't risk everything on theory." Before Maggie could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Richard Callahan, a senior partner at Silverline Technologies, Jonathan's largest client. Callahan was a man in his early 60s, tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning silver hair combed meticulously back, and a wardrobe of suits so sharp they could cut glass. His demeanor was polished but ruthless. Years of clawing through corporate ladders had left him charming in public, merciless in private. "Jonathan," Callahan's voice boomed over the speaker. "We've heard about your boys. Bad press. The word feral was used. You know we can't be tied to instability, especially not with the new contract." Jonathan's stomach dropped. This contract was worth billions, the cornerstone of his company's next 5 years. "Richard, they're 6. Children fight. Children of billionaires," Callahan interrupted coldly, "are supposed to represent control. You've lost it. Fix this, or the deal's off." The line went dead. Jonathan lowered the phone, hands trembling. He turned toward Maggie, fury boiling beneath his polished exterior. "You've cost me everything." But Maggie didn't flinch. She looked up at him, eyes firm. "No, you're letting fear cost you everything. Trust the mission. Trust them." The next night came the company gala, held in a towering hotel ballroom downtown. The chandeliers sparkled, the air smelled of champagne and money, and the city's elite filled the room with practiced laughter. Jonathan arrived in a tailored tuxedo, every detail perfect. Maggie accompanied the twins, her own dress plain navy, modest, functional, her hair let down for once, brushing her shoulders. Caleb and Carter were scrubbed clean, their jackets replaced by small pressed suits that made them look like miniature versions of their father. They clung to Maggie's hands as they entered. Jonathan tried to maintain distance, nodding curtly to Maggie as if she were simply staff. Investors swarmed him with greetings, Callahan among them, his steel-blue eyes cutting toward the twins with thinly veiled disdain. "Keep them invisible," Jonathan hissed quietly to Maggie as he moved away. But children are not invisible. Halfway through the evening, as Jonathan stood on stage preparing to address the crowd, the twins broke free. Caleb, always the bold one, tugged Carter's sleeve, and together they scampered up the steps. Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras turned. Jonathan's face blanched. His nightmare was unfolding in front of the very people whose approval meant survival. Carter gripped the microphone stand, his voice high and nervous. "Excuse me!" Caleb interrupted with theatrical volume. "We're here for a mission." Laughter bubbled among the guests, some amused, others scandalized. Callahan's face darkened. Jonathan's pulse thundered. His instinct screamed, "Drag them off, fire Maggie, salvage dignity." But Maggie, standing at the side of the stage, raised her hand in a silent signal. Jonathan froze. The twins stood together, holding out a crooked drawing they had made earlier that day, a picture of their father in a suit, standing between them, with the words scribbled in blue crayon. "Commander Dad." Caleb's voice rang through the microphone. "He's our captain. We belong to his team." For a moment, the ballroom was silent. Jonathan's throat ached, his chest tight. All eyes were on him. He had to choose, push them away to save his image or embrace them and risk everything. He took a step forward. The ballroom of the Austin Grand Hotel shimmered under chandeliers, the air thick with perfume, champagne, and the brittle sound of polite laughter. Business moguls, investors, and politicians filled the tables, their tuxedos and gowns reflecting the lights like stars. Cameras hovered along the edges of the room, reporters waiting to capture either triumph or scandal. On stage, Jonathan Mercer stood stiff in his tuxedo, trying to keep his composure even as his sons broke the script. Caleb and Carter, in their tiny suits that wrinkled at the elbows and knees, clutched Maggie Rowe's hands as they approached the center of the stage. Their eyes glowed with the mischief and courage of children who didn't know they were about to change everything. Maggie, in a plain navy dress that made her look almost invisible beside the glittering crowd, walked steady, chin high. She had faced worse than wealthy disapproval. She had faced dying men under desert skies. The guests murmured in confusion. Richard Callahan among them, his tall figure rigid in a black suit, steel blue eyes narrowing with disdain. He leaned toward a fellow executive and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "This will sink him." But then Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the crude object he and Carter had worked on for days in secret under Maggie's guidance. A medal of clay, lopsided and still faintly cracked, strung with blue ribbon. Carved into its face were clumsy words, "Mercer Team, Blue Unity." The twins raised it high with both hands. Carter's small voice rang out first, shaking but sure. "Dad, we did it together." Caleb followed, louder, steadier. "We're your team." Silence fell. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Jonathan felt the world tilt. For so long he had fought to keep appearances, to wall off grief, to protect his empire. But in that moment, seeing his boys' trembling hands and Maggie's steady presence behind them, he knew none of it mattered without this. His knees gave way. Before the crowd, before the cameras, before his own pride, he knelt and opened his arms. The twins rushed into his embrace, clay metal pressed between them. Tears filled his eyes and spilled down his face, raw and unhidden. For the first time since Rebecca's death, he wept not in private, but in front of the world. The audience erupted. Applause thundered, not polite but real, layered with something deeper recognition, envy, hope. Callahan's smirk faltered. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Investors, once stiff, were clapping with genuine smiles. What had looked like scandal became spectacle, a story not of chaos, but of resilience. Jonathan, the untouchable billionaire, revealed as a father saved by love. Among the crowd was Sarah Whitfield, a journalist in her early 30s with tall, lean build and sharp green eyes. She wore a charcoal gray blazer, her auburn hair cut in a neat bob. Sarah had built her career exposing corruption, But beneath her relentless pursuit was a history of abandonment. Her own father had walked out when she was 10. Watching Jonathan with his sons struck something in her that softened her relentless edge. She scribbled in her notebook, her expression shifting from skepticism to admiration. Tomorrow's headline was writing itself. From scandal to strength, the Mercer family's redemption. On stage, Jonathan rose slowly, still holding his son's hands. He turned toward Callahan, whose jaw was tight with barely contained frustration. "Richard," Jonathan said, voice rough but clear into the microphone, "my family isn't a liability. They're the reason I build anything worth having. If that makes you doubt me, walk away. If it makes you believe in us, then stay." The room gasped at his defiance. Callahan hesitated, calculating, but the applause swelling behind him forced his hand. He plastered on a smile, raised his glass, and muttered through clenched teeth, "To Mercer team." Cameras flashed, sealing the moment. The contract was safe, not because Jonathan had begged, but because he had stood in his truth. Behind the stage, Maggie stood at the edge of the curtain, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes glistening though she would never admit it. Rosa, who had accompanied to help with the boys, dabbed her eyes with her apron corner, whispering, "Gracias a Dios." Even Duchess, left at home, would have approved had she cared about human redemption. Far from the lights and applause, in the rehabilitation center, Elliot Rowe was packing a duffel bag. He had watched the event streamed live on a mounted television, the clay medal shining in his sister's hands. His face, rugged and scarred, had crumpled when the twins declared him their hero weeks earlier. Now he was ready. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, the limp pronounced, but his resolve stronger than it had been since he left the Marines. Nurses helped him with the paperwork, but Elliot's eyes were fixed forward, toward a future he had once thought denied to him. When he arrived at the Mercer estate days later, Maggie greeted him on the porch. Elliot was broad-shouldered though thinner now, hair trimmed short, his jaw lined with stubble. His eyes, once hollow, now carried cautious light. He carried under his arm a box of wooden scraps, wires, and tools. "Thought the boys might like to build something real," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. Caleb and Carter rushed out, their jackets bouncing, cheering, "Uncle Elliot!" They dragged him inside before he could protest. Soon the dining table was covered in pieces of wood, paint jars, and string. Elliot showed them how to sand edges, how to tie knots, how to fit pieces together. They built small obstacle models, a mini rope crawl, a tire jump made of bottle caps, a plywood wall painted blue. The boys' laughter filled the house again, their little hands steady under Elliot's guidance. Maggie stood nearby, her chest tight with pride. The house was alive, not with wealth, but with belonging. That evening, as the sun burned orange over the Texas hills, Jonathan stepped out onto the porch. Maggie was there, arms folded, watching the boys chase Duchess across the lawn while Elliot sketched another project with chalk. Jonathan's tuxedo had been replaced by a simple shirt and jeans, his hair ruffled by wind, his eyes softer. He stopped in front of her. For once, no speeches, no orders. Just one word, rough and quiet, but carrying the weight of everything. "Stay." Maggie turned her head, studying him. For months she had been the hired help, the soldier turned maid, the caretaker who patched wounds, invisible. Now she saw the man not as a billionaire, not as a client, but as someone who had finally stepped down from his fortress and learned to kneel, to laugh, to belong. She gave the smallest nod, the kind a soldier gives when accepting an oath. The twins ran up then, clay metal bouncing from its ribbon around Caleb's neck. They raised their hands together, shouting, "Mercer team! Blue unity!" And the house, once heavy with silence, echoed with laughter that promised to last. Sometimes the greatest victories do not come from contracts signed or fortunes earned, but from learning to kneel down, laugh again, and belong to the people we love. The Mercer family found unity not through control, but through rituals of kindness, small acts of trust, and the courage to say, "We are a team." In our daily lives, we all face storms, moments when chaos threatens to undo us. But like Jonathan, Maggie, Caleb, and Carter, we can choose to turn fear into mission and silence into laughter. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that family and love are stronger than wealth or fear. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story of hope and redemption. May God bless everyone watching, and if you believe in the power of unity and love, write Amen in the comments.